I was, very intrigued. I'd forgotten that, in fact, the Royal Commission was done just before the MacDonald Commission.
No, they're concurrent.
Concurrent.
Yeah.
There are obviously two very important commissions, both of which looked, for those who don't remember, the MacDonald Commission looked at national security issues, and this is following the Quebec, some of the actions against people by the RCMP following the Quebec terrorist actions and so on. And they brought out a number of recommendations, one of which was leading to CSIS and the fact that RCMP officers shouldn't have access to this information. So when you take the two together, it's fascinating because, especially in our world post 9/11, where we pass broad statutory provisions now allowing the police access to almost any information. I'm just wondering whether, looking back now, whether you would have any comments. Obviously, we've got a concern about terrorism and how we deal with it, but at the same time, we've got concerns about people's privacy, and so just wonder if you could comment.
Well, as a matter of fact, I gave a paper on that subject not long ago in Winnipeg, so I have thought about it. The question you have to ask yourself, and we'll have different answers to this question. I said earlier in my remarks that when a problem is of such a magnitude that is thought to be more important than the interest of privacy, then privacy has to yield to it. I gave some examples of that. But the question here is, at a time of emergency, when the state is at risk of being attacked, people run the risk of being killed as a result of some external force. I was dealing with in the health context, and I said, because in my last inquiry into the blood system in Canada, I had to deal with a principle called the precautionary principle. When to act when there's some evidence that something is going to happen to public health, but you haven't got proof beyond a reasonable doubt that it, you don't know that what the cause of SARS or AIDS or hepatitis C is, but when you've got some evidence, should you take precautions before you can prove by postulates that the cause is a certain organism. I said the state, the public can be under attack. Either security of the public can be the result of health problems, epidemics, so on. It also can be under attack externally by terrorism. And does the precautionary principle apply to the risk of external attack? At what stage do you say, well, the attack is very likely to happen, therefore we should impair people's civil rights because that's the only way we can deal with attack? And then I ended up saying, perhaps not. But if not, why not? And I leave that question. My own belief is we were so wrong on all those other occasions, depriving Japanese Canadians of fundamental liberty, all sorts of examples, always wrong, but we did it in the interest of protecting the public from external forces. And maybe that's what I say, perhaps not, why not? Maybe that's because we're always wrong. And so maybe the analogy isn't a true one between epidemics on the one hand and I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I think it's very interesting. Very interesting comment.
In the back there.
I'm Calvin Gottlieb.
I know that now.
And about the time you were doing all of this, I used to give my class an exercise in which they were asked to go to their own physicians and obtain their medical records. This was before the college came out. And I had a lot, and report on their experience, not their medical records, of course. And there's quite a lot of interesting things. For example, the University Health Center always gave the records. One student happened to have Morty Shulman as his GP. And when he went to Morty Shulman, Shulman was very suspicious. He thought this was the beginning of a lawsuit. And he was very, very reluctant to give these records. So it was quite a... Most students did get them. This was before the... as I said, it went to the Supreme Court. One other, another comment on a different subject here. About 5 years ago, I gave a talk at Queen's University called Privacy, a Concept Whose Time Has Come and Gone. This was at the beginning of an opening session of opening talk of a session on privacy, and this was counter to the whole spirit of the talk. But I think now if I gave the talk, I would entitle it "Security Trumps Privacy Every Time." Thank you.
Well, that's one of the... I said there would be different views on that. Yes, but every time.
I didn't say it should trump privacy every time. I'm just saying it does.
Thank you. That's a very important qualification.
By the way, just I don't know if you can hear. This man here is known as the father of computer science in Canada, Calvin Gottlieb. I knew Kelly way back in the '60s, well after you started your career. And we're really pleased to have him and Phyllis, his wife here, a very well-known science fiction writer today. So hands for these people. Other comments?
It's a great honor, sir.
Okay, I'll come over to you first and then back here.
Whoops.
Almost. You got to cut those cocktails up.
One of the issues that I've noticed in following medical data for the last several decades is that there's maybe been over-caution on the part of implementation of your recommendations. And I think it is important that we protect privacy. But there's been a big detriment to research because unless you are essentially spending extra OHIP dollars to keep the contact with the specialty care, it's very difficult to get, if you release the patient back to their original care, it's very difficult to ever get the high-quality medical information. And so you've got another level of balance that's possibly needed, and that's in the economic domain because it's not efficient or probably desirable to have the high-quality, expensive people trying to hold on to the patients just so they can get good research data. And I guess I'm wondering if there's been any consideration in that domain of trying to get a better balance, get back a little bit more to what we had, say, 2 decades ago.
Well, I don't want to answer that question. I don't want to go back to what we had, because that was not really justifiable. There is. Let me give you another anecdote. You know that Ontario has not introduced any legislation and is now thinking of doing so because of the federal legislation that, and as far as health is concerned, came into effect in January of this year. But on 3 other occasions, this I think is the 4th, on 3 other occasions, Ontario had either a policy or actual draft legislation. And on the first 2 occasions, the first occasion, there was a conference to announce the government's proposal. The minister was going to be a speaker. I was asked to be a keynote speaker, and I was. And then the minister spoke. And then 7 years went by, nothing had happened. And I was asked, would you be the keynote speaker at the conference that's going to announce new legislation in Ontario? And I said, yes, I would. The minister, I think on this occasion, the minister was busy and the deputy came, or vice versa, maybe it was the other way around. And I made a little speech and I said, you know what I've just done, ladies and gentlemen? I've just read you what I said 7 years ago. Do I think that there will be such legislation? Yes. And I sat down. There was no legislation. On the third occasion, I don't know, about 5 years later, I was asked to speak at the conference, and I laughed at them. I didn't speak. Now this legislation is occurring. And I don't think anybody who has worked on the legislation knows that there was an expensive, widely publicized Royal Commission report on the subject. On one of those occasions, and this is, I think, partly an answer to your question. On one of those occasions, I heard speaker after speaker representing different interests stand up and say, privacy is very important. Confidentiality is very important. But the interest I represent should be accepted from the obligation. And when you put it all together, as one of the drafts, one of the pieces of legislation that I saw did, it becomes not the protection of privacy, but the law for the invasion of privacy. There are too many exceptions to the general principle. As far as research is concerned, I considered it then, and I consider it now, a very high priority. And a lot of research can be done without, I shouldn't say that, confidentiality arrangements can be so structured as to not interfere with the doing of research. And a compromise has to be made up, because to say you can't have any research that involves access to patient information is wrong. Just as the college has recently made a submission to the government, it appeared in the members' dialogue, which is the college's journal that comes out every 2 months. It just made a submission to the standing committee on this, saying that the obligation of secrecy ought not to prevent the college from doing its job of making sure that the quality of service is high. So compromises have to be made, but if you give everybody who claims the right to know, and that's the phrase, the right to know, then you don't have any protection of privacy.
Mr. Krever, thank you. There was a refinement that I use in presenting to physicians about the maintenance of their medical records, is that the information on the medical record belongs to the patient, whereas the medium on which that information resides belongs to the practitioner. And very often that's not understood well by the members of the public, and frequently it's of concern as to why they can't get the medical record per se and have to actually have copies of it made. But nevertheless, that's now part of the usual way of getting these records. The second point is that physicians now increasingly are burdened with having to get consent, and consent is freely given by patients to make copies of their records to hand over to people like insurance companies, lawyers, and whoever, without really considering what it is that they're giving consent to have released. And very often a record will be quite thick, contain a lot of information which is completely unrelated to the particular issue at hand. Maybe it's a car accident or something. And yet the lawyers, by having this consent signed, it ends up being a blanket consent, are releasing everything that is in the chart, much of which has a potential to work against patients. So I think we need to educate the public a little better as to what it is they're signing when they sign a consent to release information. And it's grown, getting this consent has grown out of some of the work you've done, but the pendulum is starting to swing somewhat the other way, in that the insurance companies are now getting information through legitimate ways rather than through illegitimate ways.
Thank you.
You had mentioned the provincial legislation, which is now, I believe, currently at second reading. One of the interesting things about the Ontario legislation, we've talked about the dynamic with respect to security of individuals versus privacy of other individuals. We talked about research. One of the interesting aspects about the new legislation is that in the first draft, fundraising using a patient's personal health information for fundraising required express consent. In the new draft, that's now being changed to implied consent. So I'm wondering, like we've talked about some of the dynamics for the serious issues like research and with respect to protecting other individuals. When it comes to hospitals raising money, do you have any views as to whether that's the right approach?
I don't know the answer to the question. I think the question is a very good one, but I don't know that there is an answer. I don't know how. There's some kinds of information. That reminds me of another point. But there's some kinds of information which is in the possession of custodians of health information that really isn't health information. We called it, I don't know what it's called, census information, name and address and that sort of thing. And if that's what hospitals are using, just who are the people we have treated in the last 2 years, let us say, and all they have access is the names and addresses. I'm not sure that that's health information.
Unfortunately, my understanding is they use it actually for targeted market. So if they seem to be going for some sort of, you have lung cancer, you're going for treatment, the hospital will call you and say we're trying to raise funds for this particular, lung research facility. We know you're being treated, or you'd be interested in
I find that a little more difficult to justify. The other thought that I had, and was partly an answer to your question about research, there's a very interesting point, at least interesting to me, because I thought about this a lot for an historical reason, which I will come to in a minute. The definition in PPIDA, the federal legislation, of personal health information, I haven't got the precise words. I'll give you a second if you want it, but it says whether living or deceased, information about a person, whether living or deceased. And the thought that I have had over the years is whether or not, if the basis of the right of privacy, the interest of privacy, is the integrity of the individual, does the individual who's not an individual anymore, who's not alive, have integrity of the kind that living people have? You may not know this, but in the law, a dead person cannot be defamed. You can't libel a dead person. And the historical example occurred to me. There's a book called Churchill, the diary, taken from the diaries of Lord Moran. Lord Moran was Churchill's personal physician. And one day, he says in his introduction, he went up to his old university, Cambridge, for a dinner, and he sat next to a man who was, in fact, probably the most distinguished English historian, G.M. Trevelyan, who ignored him throughout the dinner, but at the end thought he should, be a little civil to him, turn to him, find out who he was, and he told him. And they had a long conversation in which Lord Moran told him about Churchill, and Trevelyan said to him, "You, sir, have an obligation to history to set that down in writing and record it." He knew it was an ethical problem. He wouldn't have raised it. Lord Moran wouldn't have raised it in his book if he didn't. And in fact, decided that the obligation, these aren't his words, the obligation to history with respect to a dead person was justified the revealing of information that was at one time confidential. My recollection is that there was a storm of protest about this, and that in fact the disciplinary body for doctors in the United Kingdom, the General Medical Council, in fact reprimanded him. But what about that? What about research getting what was confidential personal health information about people who are now dead, say cancer patients, that you want to study with them. Is that legislation sound in protecting the interests of people who aren't people anymore? I raised that. I've struggled with that, and I don't know. And there are situations. Professor Cotton.
Well, I'm sure you thought of it, but there's a reason why health records, the confidential health records, really do require special reading, and that is that information about you, your health, for example, DNA, pertains not only to you, but to your members of your family. Now, so if you're dead, they still pertain to your members of your family. So I would argue that because the information is not restricted to the person, there really requires special consideration.
That's very sound, and I don't disagree with it. But I'm now talking about researchers having access to it, not the public. And the researchers are under an obligation not to reveal in precise terms. You know, they would be general.
I think you did a very important part, because it's really the events when a person has died that provides the most information in the cancer study, and that's the part that is the biggest problem to get good, accurate data on right now.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I don't know how you go about it, because actually there's the earlier one, if you get a recurrence too, obviously the person's still alive. But after the person's dead, a researcher really feels a great reticence to try and track down and interact with a grieving relative, and I think that's far more egregious, to have to take that approach. That really is the only option to get good data, because the medical person who is dealing with death is not able to release.
Actually, I think I can talk loud enough.
Yeah, I think you
I'm
can.
practicing. Oh, it's recording. Sorry. I'm a practicing family doctor, 28 years in the business, and also I have a foot in the electronic medical record camp. And I want to point out 5 little comments that I think are interesting to this discussion. One is that a fairly essential part of somebody's chart, of the cumulative patient profile part, is a whole section called family history.
Right.
And when we release a patient's chart, family history goes along with it.
Yes.
And that can include information from any relative in the family.
Okay, there's a qualification that I have in my report about that.
Okay. Another thing is that many times when you're taking somebody's history, particularly if it has to do with psychiatric problems, you're taking history. And in one case in particular, where a woman was abused by her elder brother back when he was 14 years old. And that comment from a patient, in this case, I believe is correct, but in many cases, there may be some doubt about it. It goes into the record, and we don't really go out of our way to say, patient states that. And many times there are statements like that in a record that really you don't want out there in general. I'd like to sort of extend a little bit on another comment I made about reporting a physician's venereal disease. Would you report a venereal disease of the spouse of the medical officer of health? There's a dilemma right there. Because the medical officer of health would see that report crossing his or her desk.
Well, that's so, what do I say? So...
Contrived.
No, I mean, it's so unlikely to happen that there have to be, I didn't go into this. There were protections. When I said they were entitled to it, I didn't mean absolutely entitled. There are situations, a larger number than you cited, of cases in which the information should not be revealed, at least in its present form. And I said in my report, there should be some mechanism for a physician to object to releasing the report or the whole report at no monetary cost to the physician. I didn't think the physician should have to go into court, retain a lawyer, I thought there should be some respected official who could be a kind of an ombudsperson who could decide, could be the privacy commissioner, could decide that in this situation it is justified on the part of the physician not to reveal that bit of information. You had more. Did you have more? You said you had 4 or 5.
A couple more short comments. One is the comment that Peter made that there's a tendency now for insurance companies to ask for a photocopy of the entire chart. 20 years ago, they would ask for a quick summary of whether the patient needed insurance. Another thing that's happening in our society is that people are now receiving benefits from their own insurance company for the injuries they suffer. And we no longer have this buffer of a lawyer telling the patient, no, you don't have to give the insurance company that information. The insurance company is getting much more information, I'm sure, than they did back in the 1979 era. And one last comment is that in reaction to the patient getting their own chart, there's been a definite tendency over the last 20 years for medical language to change so that it carries meaning in between the words. It's become much more polite, as you can imagine, but the meanings are still getting across.
Well, you remind me of 2 other anecdotes. If you've got time for it, I'll try to be quick. The first, we haven't got into it, but where this question is very sensitive is in genetic diseases, as you know. And I recall, I'll never forget it, this is wearing a different hat on reviewing research proposals involving human subjects, during the course of which a physician, who specialist in genetic disease, a particular genetic disease, told me of an episode that occurred. The parents brought a child who had certain symptoms for an assessment, and it was discovered that the child had a genetic disease. And the doctor said to the parents who brought the child, because this is a genetic disease, it would be advisable to examine all the other children and test the parents as well. And they said yes and left. And a little while later, the mother came back and says, "Doctor, there's something I should tell you. Although he doesn't know it, my husband is not the father of that child." Now there's an example of something. What does the doctor do with that? That was his problem. Does he record it? It's I think, an acute example of what you mentioned. But let me also conclude with an exchange between me and a hospital superintendent, they were called in those days, or administrator, hospital administrator, about the question of access to information. And this is the exchange. It's almost verbatim. Mr. So-and-so, if I went to your hospital and asked to see the chart on me, would you let me have it? Certainly not. If I went to my lawyer and I gave a consent and an authorization to my lawyer, and the lawyer wrote to you asking you to release the information, and the lawyer would pay for the cost of reproducing it, would you give it to the lawyer? The answer, yes. I said, well, why would you give it? Why do I have to have a lawyer to get information about me? What right does my lawyer have that's higher than my right? And he said, well, the patient would be protected by having another professional person intervene to look at the chart. And I said, all right, now suppose you get a letter from a lawyer asking for information about a patient, and you suspect the lawyer wants the information because of a possible malpractice action against a doctor in the hospital or the hospital. Would you release it? Certainly not. Well, I mean, it showed I think, the paternalistic nature of the objection to patients having.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and there's 3 events that are going to occur now. I'll try to do it in the right sequence. Firstly, to Shirley.
Well, I'd like to thank Honourable Horace Krever for a wonderful presentation today. It's so interesting to hear the history of what you've done, and as well to your observations of the current situation. So I thank you very much. And I guess in token of that, I'd like to give you a small gift as part of our appreciation for coming here today. Dominic, you
Thank you very much.
This is the picture. Some of you have seen it before. This is done by one of our own artists here at the University of Waterloo, Donald McKay. It is the oddest picture of the world. We claim it well represents the healthcare system. And, we hope it will be on, and everyone will notice it as the first work. So thank you very much. That's the artist, by the way, in his best form.
And of course, we'll see you next month on April 28th for our next seminar. And I'm going to pass it over to Dominic at this point.
So what I'll do is, my first part of the surprise is to have Ian Kyer maybe make the closing remarks for Horace.
Hi. Ian Kyer is my name. I'm here with one of my partners, John Beardwood, making some comments about the fundraising aspect of the new legislation. We're both lawyers with the firm of Pass and Markman, and we have the pleasure of sponsoring this program today. Thinking about the results of the fact I try and keep in contact with this place. I have 2 degrees from the University of Waterloo. Grew up in computer, over here and did a third in computer science. But I was going to tell you that I actually left and went into history. I did a BA and an MA. Then went on to do a PhD in the University of Toronto Center for Medieval Studies. The fact that I'm a lawyer demonstrates what the market is for medieval historians. But the good fortune is I ended up, of all things, doing IT law. And it really goes back to the courses I took here at the University of Waterloo, because when I started to practice law, the information technology age we're all now taking for granted was just starting to get going, and we had companies that were coming to us as lawyers and saying, we're buying major computer systems, or we're having software developed, and we need some legal advice. And I was the only lawyer who knew anything about computers at all. I mean, not much, but I knew a wee little bit, and that was the beginning of what turned out to be a very good career for me in information technology law. I now head up something called the TIP Group, Technology and Intellectual Property, for our national firm, which is one of Canada's largest. We have, I forget how many offices now, Vancouver, Calgary, Yellowknife, Toronto, Montreal, Quebec City. We have offices in London, England, New York, and Johannesburg, South Africa. Diamond is why we're in Johannesburg, South Africa. The diamond mining in Yellowknife. Anyway, that's another story. But we had I came in contact with this place, and so I know Donna Covey, and I know Don Cowan and other people here at the university, and we were chatting one day about the fact that this seminar program exists, and we said, look, we'd be happy to in fact sponsor some program on the legal aspects of health informatics, because our firm does a lot of work in that area. And ironically, we both came up with the same name to speak at this program, and that was Justice Krever. I know Justice Krever as a law professor and as a person who I, in fact, interviewed when I was doing a history of legal education. That's another story. Lots of stories. But anyway, and Dominic worked with him, I gather, on this convention. And so we both said, what a great person to, in fact, present both a historical and insightful look at some of the more pressing issues that health informatics faces. Privacy. I mean, we all think of privacy as obviously access to records, but what we're doing now, of course, we're generating technology that makes the collection of information, whether it's in the records or not, extremely easy to do. And in fact, I'm working at the moment for a client that's going to be providing technology to Canada Health Infoway that goes out and pulls all of these databases that are out there and collects all this information about people's medical history and personal history and so on to make it available to people. And that's something that the government of Canada is doing. There are going to be all sorts of protections in place, we hope, to deal with all of that. But that's the sort of technology that's out there now, and that's one of the challenges we face. And I hope that, in fact, the information, or the privacy will not be the first casualty on the information highway, which is what the president of this university once wrote in a report he did for the Canadian government. Anyway, thank you very much, Professor Krever, Professor Justice, for a great presentation.
Before you sit down, we have one further surprise, and it's to honor you for several things. One, helping us to get Justice Krever here, and two, you surprised us today with the fact that it wasn't a surprise. Wow. And there's some goodies for everybody, and afterwards there are refreshments and cake. Happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
All of you to grab party favors, make noise, refreshments in the back. Pick on Ian particularly and have a chance to talk with Justice Krever.
Happy birthday.
All right. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Ian. Happy birthday to you. Hey, be sure you take cake. We have nothing to do with it if we take it home to your kids if nothing else.